Welcome everyone to another CoinDesk seminar. Today we bring this seminar very well timed, and I'll get to that in a moment, why it's so well timed. Today is all about why Layer 2 will change the game for Ethereum. And the context really is that the future is here. There's been a world of new applications that you don't even need to explain to people anymore. NFTs seem intuitive, DeFi seems like everyone's doing it, and all kinds of new demand for transaction types and relationships formed on blockchains, commercial relationships formed, secured, negotiated in some cases on blockchains. And the ability for these trends to change the game has become more apparent than ever. However, all of this energy towards scaling and delivering on all the promises a lot of blockchain folks have said for years, we're here now. And that's why the timing is so interesting. So with all these new transaction types, with all these new secure forms of relationships being established, we still have a world where we don't exactly know what future will be the right one for scaling and which solutions will be adopted and which ones will work. And that's why this week, this whole context of change the game becomes really interesting. Vitalik Buterin, who is the founder of Ethereum, just came out with a great piece called The Endgame, really about the last design decisions that are required to get to this billion daily user system where we can actually onboard 1 billion users who make 1 billion transactions individually in a day. And those engineering decisions that are made will really become the blueprint for everyone to copy. So it's the last few design decisions that we're looking at here in order to deliver this future. And with that, right, we've got all kinds of people still debating. Maybe some of these solutions are a dead end. Maybe these ones are the right way forward. But in this document and in the sessions today, we're going to take a look at some of these choices, these final choices that will be made to deliver the full promise of blockchains, and find out which of these design choices are going to persist, which ones are going to add to the entire goal of decentralized systems that people can use to leverage their own talents, their own abilities, and be able to have secure relationships with all kinds of users. So the change in the game really is about this end game idea, right? The last design decisions that will allow the full vision that most folks have been able to ideate on for the past few years. So the first talk we have today is really just about L2 innovation in general. And we've got Haseeb, who's a managing partner in the Dragonfly Capital, and he wrote a tremendous article this summer, which I had the pleasure of reading. And I think it brings a great context here, which is this idea that nobody will care about rollups. And that's really what we're talking about here. Remember, these are the last design decisions that can bring us to the 1 billion daily users. We're talking about the convergence of designers and engineers that will learn from these final design decisions and be able to deliver these products and services. So when Haseeb wrote about that, he's saying, perhaps there are other avenues that will just be shorter and will bring us to that 1 billion daily user piece. So joining Haseeb will be Piotr, who is a founder and researcher at L2BEAT, which is a really new data site, really neat new data site. I've had a chance to look at it, really talking about how these layer 2s above Ethereum are generating interest, generating activity, and how they're being used to secure these relationships, and how they'll help bring us to that 1 billion user a day threshold that sort of is a psychological threshold, but a really important one nevertheless. Piotr, welcome. And finally, we have got Agne, who is the host of the L2 show. So a show focused on these issues, and she'll be hosting this session between these great guests. Really, once again, talking about these design decisions and all the benefits that are available with every one of these decisions, and we'll be able to see exactly what we have to be excited about and what these transformations might look like. So welcome, everyone. And I'll hand the mic over to Agne first, who is going to be running this conversation. Thanks, everyone. I hope it's useful.
Thank you very much, Nolan. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Layer 2 seminar. I'm very pleased to have Haseeb and Piotr on this panel. I think it will be a very exciting discussion. So let's start from what Nolan has mentioned, the last piece by Vitalik Buterin called Endgame. What he was talking about is about creating this big blockchain, right, that is censorship resistant and trustless. Here in the Layer 2 seminar, we're talking about Layer 2s. As Haseeb has said, roll-ups are really sort of favored by Ethereum literati. I think this is how you framed it in your article. And Vitalik himself is saying that no single roll-up can handle all of this data. So while Piotr is saying that roll-ups are not totally decentralized while we're going towards decentralization. So although we have this endgame vision with multi-roll-up ecosystem and this big blockchain, what is actually happening? So may I invite Haseeb to share his views about the Layer 2 and roll-ups specifically?
I'm happy to, and thanks for having me, Agne. So, you know, I wrote this piece a while ago. I think this was closer, sometime in the summer, where this was a moment I think that felt like kind of peak Layer 2 hype. It was before actually most of the Layer 2s had even launched. So I think at that time you had both Optimism and Arbitrum still in sort of gated form, so that most users couldn't interact with the stuff going on there or deploying the applications there. And what I predicted at that time was that you know, the Layer 2 story had a lot of similarities to the Plasma stories. I don't know if people remember Plasma way back in the day. Plasma was sort of the original Layer 2 design on Ethereum. It was co-designed by Joseph Poon and by Vitalik Buterin. And the idea behind Plasma, it was kind of very similar story to what we talked about with rollups, is that it was going to be a very decentralized and, you know, kind of very easy to use, very fast, very cheap, very scalable Layer 2 built on top of Layer 1 that had similar trust properties to the kind of stuff that people were doing on Layer 1, which at that time was mostly transfers and trading tokens. It became very clear that Plasma wasn't going to be usable for smart contracts, which is what most people in the end really wanted to do on Layer 2. They didn't just want to transfer assets. They wanted to do, you know, sort of more higher level functionality like they have today in DeFi. At the time, though, that wasn't really obvious. But the reality is eventually we got some Plasmas, and most people don't spend that much time thinking about the fact that we did eventually get some Plasmas. And for the most part, no one used them. Nobody really cared that the Plasmas existed, that they were fairly decentralized. The only things that people actually used were things like XDAI, which is basically just a sidechain. It's you know, it's like a proof of authority sidechain, so it's not even meaningfully decentralized to the extent that some sidechains like Polygon are even kind of decentralized. So now at the time in the summer, when you started to see these Layer 2s go live, like Arbitrum, that it was the first one to open up, and then, you know, Optimism eventually started opening up as well. You know, what we see today is that most of the activity, most of the users, most of the TVL is moving on to these other Layer 1s that are EVM compatible. So you're seeing, you know, things like Polygon and Avalanche and Binance Smart Chain start to gobble up TVL, gobble up developers, gobble up users, and basically be the place where most of the action is happening. And Arbitrum, actually, I'm looking at L2BEAT right now. Arbitrum has just, you know, a little bit over 2 billion in TVL compared to the, you know, almost 20 billion in TVL that you see on something like Binance Smart Chain. So it seems to me, I mean, obviously we're not at the end of this path yet. Optimistic rollups, the reality is today, they're quite a bit more expensive than these other Layer 1s. But from the perspective of a user, they don't feel any different. They look the same. You have to, you know, go across the bridge. You have to pay, you know, you pay lower fees. There's a bunch of DeFi on there, right? Like that's what it looks like if you're a normal retail user, or you're a trader, or you're, you know, some kind of DeFi participant. And for those people, most of what they care about is not whether or not Vitalik approves of the security model. What they care about is, okay, when I move to the bridge, how's the bridge? When I get there, how are the fees? When I get there, what can I do? And it seems that the answer to most of these things is being right now better served by these other Layer 1s that have different security models. They're not the Ethereum security model, but for the most part, give users more of what they want today. I think eventually that might change, but it doesn't seem to be the case at the present moment.
Right. So I see what you're saying. Basically, what we were promised with blockchain is banked and banked, access to everyone. And right now, if you're in a developing country, it costs around $600 or more to deploy smart contracts. It's not really so trustless or censorship resistant. Well, it is censorship resistant in Ethereum case, maybe not so much with the other layer ones. We'll see what happens. But so the big topic is obviously decentralization. We are going towards that. It is a difficult way, but many of the believers believe that this is the only way to go. Piotr, may I ask for your opinion about this?
Yeah, of course. So I want to echo some of what Haseeb said, that yes, what we see is that users are on those other layer ones. But what I feel like is the real strong value proposition of layer 2 is the fact that the idea is that it's going to inherit the security properties of Ethereum. And what this means, of course, is that you're going to enjoy the same level of censorship resistance, the same level of resilience, the same level of, if you do a transaction, you don't have to worry that what you're using will go offline, like some of the blockchains can do if they are run by a central set of validators. But the decentralization aspect is very important in this case, but not realized in the current layer 2s. And this is because the technology is tricky to implement. We have the framework, right? The framework is take the data that the blockchain would normally process, post it on layer 1, don't do any execution, have the execution be done on layer 2, and voila, you get scaling. Okay, but then you have to implement it. And as it turns out, you either have to implement the ZK proofs, which our research area. There are solutions that use them right now. So the technology isn't, it was Moonmath some time ago. Now it's no longer is, but building a system that can support smart contracts with it is hard. And there are multiple teams like Starkware and zkSync working on it. On the other hand, we have optimistic rollups, right, which seem to be easier to implement, but then you kind of have to implement an EVM and EVM and with the fraud proofs. So the challenge is still there. And the challenge is so big that the systems that we have right now haven't yet fully achieved this grand vision. And they run with training wheels. And by training wheels, I mean the systems have admins, they have owners, they have upgradability, which basically means that the security model of the current layer 2s is in some ways comparable to the security model of those other layer 1s. They can go offline, they can have patents, they can change the implement under the user's feet. Now, while we can say, okay, that's bad for now, we also must think about the fact that those other layer 1s won't be able to provide other security guarantees in the future. Well, the hope is the layer will be able to eventually become decentralized and realize Vitalik's vision from Endgame, where we enjoy maybe not all of the same security properties that Ethereum has, but at least most of them. And this will allow users to enjoy a level of innovation that is currently reserved to those that can pay hundreds of dollars per transaction.
Yes, what do you think, Piotr? So really, if a user cares about security of Ethereum so much, so likely is a big whale, so he can easily afford the fees of Ethereum layer 1. And really, how can a user verify the security features of a rollup? As you wrote, Piotr, yourself, how can a user verify what's actually deployed, whether it was written in the white paper? So right now, what they care is easy access to Polygon or some other layer 1s, some having fun farming, low fees. So it seems that the users are actually driving where the ecosystem is going, where the protocols are going, or we will still stick to our decentralization and strong blockchain network effect. Haseeb, what do you think?
Well, I think it's also worth making a distinction between types of rollups. So, there are two kinds of rollups. There are optimistic rollups, and then there are ZK rollups. And I think talking about them both as though their trajectories and trade-offs are the same is probably is probably unwise. So, I mean, given this whole panel is about L2, so we should probably distinguish the two. So, the optimistic rollups are the main thing that are sort of active today, meaning Arbitrum and Optimism, and then of course there's Boba, and there's a few others that are in this category. And in some sense, these are easier to get off the ground if you want to do generalized computation, because the optimistic rollups. A kind of one sentence description of an optimistic rollup is that I sort of assumed that you did the computation correctly, and if in fact you didn't, then later I can sort of challenge you in court and then prove that you lied about the computation. But otherwise, we'll just sort of pretend that you did everything right, which is it's actually a good description of how the world works. Which is that most of the time we don't if I sign a contract with you, I don't go and prosecute it immediately and say did you exactly follow every letter of this contract? I sort of assume you did, and if I think you didn't, then I can go try to prove it. But most of the time, I just everyone assumes everyone else is following the law, and so it's a good idea, and it naturally does offer a significant constant factor improvement in scaling, but it comes with its own problems. And one of the big problems with optimistic rollups is that so one, it is only a constant factor scaling, and it can't really butt up against a sort of anything beyond that constant increase in scaling. But the other thing about it that is that makes things challenging for an optimistic rollup is that it requires these long, what are called challenge periods. Basically meaning that let's say you and I have a contract, and at the end of the contract, I'm supposed to pay you some money, right? Let's say you're supposed to build my house, and after you build the house, I'm supposed to pay you. Well, I can't keep once you actually build the house, I have to then inspect the house, make sure that the house is right, and then I pay you. Otherwise, if I've already paid you and you already made the house, and I go in and find the pipes are broken, then I'm kind of screwed, right? I can't. How am I going to get my money back? So in crypto, the same thing is true in optimistic rollups. Is that there's a certain period of time that I have to basically inspect the work you've done before I have to pay you. And if I pay you before then I'm kind of screwed, right? And what that causes in an optimistic rollup is that if I want to withdraw from an optimistic rollup, that's like my house inspection time. That is the time that I have to verify that the work was done correctly, meaning that I can't actually get the money out. I can't actually withdraw until that challenge period is over. And so that challenge period for most of these optimistic rollups is parameterized to be 7 days. Meaning that if I want to withdraw, I have to wait 7 days before I can get my withdrawal out, which is much longer than even a centralized exchange. It's a very, very long time in most, if you're trying to, dart out of a Ponzi scheme, then okay, 7 days is long enough for the whole thing to fall apart behind you. So for that reason, now there are a lot of proposals on how to solve this problem for optimistic rollups, like what's known as fast exits. And fast exits are basically just market makers. So it's okay, somebody has money on both sides, and they give you some money on this side because they know that you're going to be withdrawn, but it requires them to have liquidity. It requires them to have inventory, and sometimes market makers aren't going to hold inventory for random shitcoins that you're trying to get out of. So if you're in some ohm fork and you're hoping that somebody's going to give you a fast exit, well, a market maker might not want to have ownership of some ohm fork on both inside your L2 and outside your L2. So it's going to make things complicated, and it's going to cause people to have to pay some slippage in order to move out of the layer 2 if they want to do it quickly, the way that they do out of a Polygon or an Avalanche or one of the other chains that they're more used to dealing with exits. So this is the big problem with optimistic rollups. Now on the other side, you have ZK rollups, and the ZK rollups today are relatively small in TVL, right? So you have Starkware and you have ZK Sync, and ZK Sync has a sort of generalized zero knowledge rollup, whereas Starkware kind of has individual application-specific rollups that they've launched in partnerships with specific apps, like with DYDX. So ZK rollups are different in that they're quite a bit cheaper than optimistic rollups. I think by a factor of 3 or so. They're cheaper on a per transfer basis or per instance basis. But for ZK rollups, it's much harder to do generalized computation. But we're at a point now where, to Piotr's point about them being moon mathy, the moon math was just okay, how do you transfer people stuff in zero knowledge, and it's kind of super fancy math computation. But to actually do generalized computation is even harder. And for a long time, this was thought to be impossible. So it was perceived that the only way to do generalized computation was in the optimistic style. And if you wanted to do it in ZK, good luck, maybe in 10 years, we'll figure out how to do that. But in the last year and a half, we've had an enormous amount of research into how to do what we now call ZK EVM, meaning proving execution of the EVM, the Ethereum virtual machine, in zero knowledge, to the point where we now have realistic proposals of how this is going to get done over the next year or two. And so both ZK Sync, the Matter Labs team, and Starkware are working on instances of how to do generalized computation in zero knowledge. And this is going to cause a very different kind of rollup in the future. Now, we're not ready for them yet. It's going to be a while before they're production ready, much less when they're initially going to be launched. But with ZK EVM, this, I think, allows you to get to a different set of trade-offs that are much more exciting to me about how layer 2s can function. So for one, there's no challenge periods with ZK. So if you're doing something in zero knowledge, that means you're proving it's correct. You're not hoping it's correct, right? It's like, you build my house and then I, put up some kind of, cryptographic scanner that proves that the house is correctly built, and then boom, I pay you, we're done. I don't have to hang out for a week and like check out the pipes, right? That it holds a lot more promise for the kinds of experience that users expect when they're interacting with a layer 2 and potentially having to move money in and out. But then second, with a ZK rollup, not only are the fees significantly lower just because of there's less overhead that has to be posted on chain, but there's a lot more. There are further places you can go if you're willing to ease some of the requirements of data availability. So there's this notion of what's called a Validium, which is a very different kind of rollup. It's different from it's not what we traditionally think of as a rollup, but it's something in between, more like a ZK Plasma type thing. But it allows you to know that the transactions that are happening on chain are correct, even if you don't have the data on Ethereum to reconstruct those transactions. And if you use a Validium, then you can basically get cost savings and levels of payment that are as cheap as the kinds of transactions you see on Polygon. So most if you're going to interact with ZK EVM, most likely transfers are going to be on the order of call it 50 cents, $1, something in that ballpark, right? Like cheaper than what you see on something like Arbitrum, but not insanely cheap. But if you get something like a Validium where you're not paying the cost of having to put some data on Ethereum every single transaction, then you can start to see costs come down to be similar to what people are experiencing on these non-Ethereum blockchains. So that's what I'm really excited about in the longer term for rollups. In the shorter term, I think most of what we see on Arbitrum and Optimism today, they're kind of band-aids on top of the Ethereum experience. It's like it's this kind of middle. It's sort of like, I think most users want to live on the barbell. So one side of the barbell is Ethereum, super high security. It's where all the money is. Like that's the place to be if you want to transact for really high amounts of capital, or if you just want to have access to the very cutting edge of DeFi protocols. And then the other side of the barbell is the super cheap stuff. So Binance Smart Chain, Polygon, Avalanche, etc. This is the stuff where it's super low cost to transact, and even if you're in developing markets, you can afford to interact with this stuff. That's where I think most users will want to live. And unless you're in one side of the barbell, I think it's going to be a fairly narrow set of users who want to interact with those applications.
Right. So it's a couple of interesting points that you raised here. I remember the original Bitcoin white paper, white blockchain, no single point of failure. So obviously we know that layer ones, they are sort of like organizations that provide a blockchain style, I don't know if it's nice to say that, blockchain style database, let's put it this way, to enable DeFi, similar DeFi applications, etc. Why Ethereum is strong? Because it's distributed all over the world, and why these, just for a simple user, and these layer ones, they do have validators, but they have, let's say, much less validators, like 1,000 validators for some of the layer ones. So that means that it could be a single point of failure. Also, I want just to explain to a simple user, what did you mean by bridging and by this withdrawal period? So let's say if you are on Ethereum layer 1 and you want to go to Arbitrum layer 2, you have to use a bridge. So there are official bridges that you get there, and you have your money in the same address on Arbitrum. And to withdraw, if you're using optimistic rollups, which is the case of Arbitrum, we have to wait for 7-day withdrawal periods. Yes, there are projects, bridges that operate pools. So how it works, These liquidity providers have liquidity on both sides, on Ethereum Layer 1 and on Ethereum Layer 2. And so they take the risk of withdrawal. So then you can withdraw much faster, like straight away. And then this optimistic rollup challenge period stays in their hands. Just to explain a little bit of background. What I know, what is very interesting for Piotr is upgradability of smart contracts and all of these rollup solutions. Piotr, can you speak a little bit more about this?
Yes, of course. So basically, Ethereum smart contracts are by default immutable, right? So if you, for example, want to read the code of Uniswap v2, right? You go to Etherscan. Etherscan shows you the bytecode and also the source code in Solidity. You can see that the contract has some functions. You can deposit money into it. You can swap, and that's it, right? You know that, for example, in 2 days, in 2 weeks, in 2 years, the contract is going to be the same. Now, there is a pattern called a proxy in Ethereum smart contracts, which means that you can have a contract that delegates its execution to another contract. So, for example, I could have a contract that manages some amount of money, but allows someone to change the rules of the money is managed. Because, for example, you would like to change the interest rate or how the curve is calculated and stuff. So what you do is you deploy 2 contracts. One contract is the one that delegates the execution, and the other holds the current system. And if you want to change the rules of the system, you deploy a 3rd contract and say to the first one, look now on the 3rd contract to know what rules to follow. And this mechanism preserves the fact that the contracts cannot be changed, but also enables the contract to follow different rules in the future. And this is especially good for products in development, because if I have a smart contract, but it's not in this finished state, however we want to define it, I still want to tinker with it, right? I can add this upgradability to it in order for me to fix potential bugs, add new features, and basically enable a more traditional, let's say, Web2 experience where, you know, apps constantly improve over time. However, the idea, I guess, is progressive decentralization. So users over time expect that this pattern of changing the implementation will cease, that no longer it will be that someone will tinker with the smart contract so that they can put full trust into it, right? Because in traditional systems, you need to put some trust into the system in order to use it, right? With banks, with, I don't know, custodians, right? But the big innovation of smart contracts is that the trust is eliminated. With the upgradability, we bring back trust in the hope that it's only for a short period of time. And then after this trust is removed, we get all of the nice properties of Ethereum. And the reason why upgradability is important for layer 2s is that almost all of the layer 2s have this upgradability right now enabled. And this implementation can change. And so this is why I think it's important for third parties like L2BEAT to monitor this, because the security properties change over time. And I think it's worth looking at to not have unexpected changes.
Yes, definitely recommend everyone to read a recent article of Piotr and L2BEAT team. Is $6 billion locked in layer 2 secure. Pretty interesting indeed to have a glance. Haseeb, let's go back a bit more from the user's perspective. So when do you think the layer 2s will be ready and easy to use for the user? When do you think they will not care anymore whether it's Polygon or Arbitrum is just, plug in and you have a nice UI? Do you think
well,
we're
I
far
think,
away?
Yeah, getting to a nice UI, I don't think, I'm not that worried about, how long it'll take to get to a nice UI. To get to a nice UX, I think is a difference. Well, UX meaning user experience as opposed to like how it looks and feels. when you're talking about a blockchain, there's a classic framework that I think about very often, which is about whether it's possible to compete on indirect properties of a system. So an indirect property of a system is something you can't actually feel as a user. And one such property is like security, right? If a system that you're using is secure or not secure, you actually can't feel the difference. You don't know for certain whether something you're using is secure or insecure. You might go to something like L2BEAT and you might look up, how do they do state validation? What's the upgradability? What happens if a sequencer fails? But just as a normal user, when you're interacting with the system, those are imperceptible to you, right? And so for that reason, it's oftentimes very difficult to compete on something that's intangible, that isn't directly perceptible, like security or like decentralization. The way in which you compete on those things is only if and when consumers develop a preference that makes it very, very difficult for them to want to interact with something that doesn't have certain properties. And today we can see very clearly that's not the case for most users in crypto. They don't have strong preferences for security. That's why they use things like sidechains. That's why they use things like Binance Smart Chain, which is not even ostensibly decentralized. The reason why they use it is not because they think that the only security model that they're willing to trust is one that's fully decentralized in the form of Ethereum. The reality today, and I think it's going to be a while until much of this changes, is that what Ethereum protects you against, and just to be totally pragmatic here, right? What Ethereum protects you against is sort of nation state level attacks. Right, that's the level of security that Ethereum provides from the perspective of most users. And something like a Binance Smart Chain protects you from basically Binance deciding to not do the right thing, right? And if Binance decides that like, hey, we're going to start messing with Binance Smart Chain, or we're going to stop providing APIs that allow people to actually read the state of the blockchain, because running a node for Binance Smart Chain is extremely difficult, and most people, even with high-end servers can actually sync nodes to Binance Smart Chain. So if you're basically relying on the Binance doing the right thing, for most users, it's like, okay, well, I'm already relying on Binance to do this right thing because I use their exchange, and a lot of my money is on their exchange. And so if they're going to screw me on their exchange, then I guess they'll also screw me on Binance Smart Chain. But it's like, I'm already taking that risk, so I might as well, in for a penny, in for a pound. I think eventually you're going to see the attitude of consumers change with respect to what they expect out of the security model of the blockchains they interact with. And I think one of the obvious reasons why they will care about that is that the moment when consumers started really caring about exchanges was when Mt. Gox shut down. And it takes a high profile failure for people to suddenly feel that, hey, it really, really matters which particular exchange I deposit my funds into. And now, we just heard about another exchange failure that again, is the reason why most people now trust only the really, really high credibility exchanges. And it's where, they do almost all of the volume, and most of these long tail exchanges don't do very much at all. It's because consumers now have this preference because they now feel the consequences of failure. And I think what you're going to see at some point is we're going to start seeing failures, and those failures might happen on certain layer ones that end up, they end up failing in high profile ways, whether it be validation failures or revolts or things like this. I mean, you saw, I remember we just saw EOS basically rise up and revolt against some of the early commitments that they made to reward some of the early organizations such as Block One that were instrumental in setting them off the ground. I mean, I tend to support that activity but it is nevertheless like it's a blockchain that basically broke one of its core covenants, which is that Block One gets the block reward, and they're like, never mind, you don't get a block reward. It's like, okay, what else could they have decided to change? Could they have rewritten history? Could they have gone in and said, okay, we're going to delete the stake owned by Block One and fundamentally rewrite things that we otherwise would think would be immutable? There's a lot of history that's going to play out in crypto. We're still in the very, very early innings of all this stuff. And I think over time, to say nothing of layer 2, I think it's likely that we're also going to see layer 2 failures. To Piotr's point, the reason why we have these coordinators and the reason why so much of this stuff is being handled with kid gloves right now is because it's all beta software. None of this stuff has existed in the wild for that long, and it's likely we're going to see. Arbitrum has been down for a couple hours, which may or may not mean that much to you depending on your view of this stuff. But there's going to be dramatic failures at some point, because there's almost no way that we wrote these incredibly complex systems that we could have just invented a couple of years ago, and there are no major bugs. That just doesn't happen. Like, even Ethereum has had major bugs. Every blockchain has had major bugs. And so it's likely that we're going to see those in layer 2 as well. And so all that is to say, it's going to take some time before we understand how secure these things are, before users understand how secure these things are, and before they start to eventually start migrating their preferences toward these more robust security models. But in the interim, this is, again, one of the reasons why I think you're seeing so much adoption of these other layer 1s that are EVM compatible and have these bridges that go back to Ethereum, is because the security model for these other layer 1s is actually much simpler than for an optimistic rollup today. Because an optimistic rollup, look, if you screw up the code, then crap, the whole thing might break and all the money might get stranded. Like, who knows? We don't really know what failure modes to expect out of these things. If the security model is correct, then it's all solid. But if the security model is not correct, then you're kind of screwed. And the same thing is true for ZK rollups as well. Whereas for these other layer 1s, if they screw up, it's like, okay, well, they can just fork and it's fine. But if a layer 2 screws up, you can't fork Ethereum to go save a layer 2. Right? I think depends on the preferences of Ethereum users. But today, I'd imagine that there's nothing that's too big to fail anymore on Ethereum.
Thank you, Haseeb. Listening to you, what it reminded me, we're all talking that the trust lies in decentralization, and this is what we think that people would prefer. But then people again go towards centralized big authorities because they feel more comfortable. And I remember too big to fail banks. How many banks failed, but people still trust the banking system to put the money. It's really quite funny. And so when we're talking about crypto users, I think we also have to let's say justify different users. There are new users. There are users who have been since 2016 who really value the security, who understand all these layer 2s and all these layer 1s. And there are the new users who maybe think, yeah, maybe this is the future. Maybe this is the way we will transact in the next 10 years, and they want to get in. Maybe they don't really want to get into so much details like Piotr does to understand the security and read the smart contracts. So it will be definitely interesting to see how things pan out. I would like to hear Nolan's views, as I can see he's back on the screen.
Yeah, I'm here to just give a quick reaction to everything I heard. I thought that was really interesting. And if I could summarize what you said, Haseeb, tell me if I'm wrong. Am I hearing that in the end, user choice has a lot to do with the way these things are going to get built out. However, user choice can still be influenced by the almost tectonic shifts as security becomes more obvious, or decisions are influenced by previous, catastrophes, let's say. So in the same way that Mt. Gox taught everyone not your keys, not your coin, and sort of turned that into a maxim for the industry, there are other major shifts that can come as we make these final design decisions. The consequences of failure will help push those users into the let's say optimized systems. Is that what I'm hearing?
That's right. And the other thing too is that you have to compete on the merits too, right? It's not enough to say I'm more decentralized than you, and therefore, come use me and move all your money over to me. And it's like, okay, well, that's not what users respond to, right? You have to not only be secure, but you have to also offer a better experience.
Mm-hmm. And that's where, let's say, in the case of, you'd mentioned how, let's say, Lightning had taken, it had been there was a runaround. Basically, people were using wrapped Bitcoin, and a lot of traders could still, do what you could have done with Lightning without
That's
Lightning,
right.
in fact. And now we're starting to see a lot more Lightning enthusiasm and push. But I do wonder if, when we do decide that this scaling for L2, and I'm going to be talking a bit more about this with Agne later on the optimistic rollup piece, but, isn't pushing a lot of that computation off and then trusting the layer, the L1 again, and all of its security, isn't that what Bitcoin has already done? Isn't that the model already?
Sorry, in what sense? You're talking about
in the sense
Lightning?
that computationally, there's no EVM, no one ever said aren't a lot of things essentially a roll up on Bitcoin? Am I wrong to think that way?
A few. I mean, not a lot that people use, but you know, Bitcoin does have its own VM. It's a pretty tiny VM. It doesn't do a whole lot, but yeah, there are a few things that are like that are sort of, you know, that are implanted into the Bitcoin blockchain, but there's no validation. But there's not a whole lot that people actually adopted very in high quantities that has that nature on Bitcoin.
Yeah. No, but what I liked about what you said though is that, you know, things. It's not so much the lack of popularity that hasn't allowed that, you know, the Lightning piece on Bitcoin to take off and use some of that dexterity. It's more that there hasn't been enough people and there hasn't been enough learning from failure and iteration and feedback loops and A/B testing and all those other pieces.
That's right. And I also want to give credit where credit's due, right? Like the roll-ups are all new. So Arbitrum, Optimism, like they just came out. They're still working on a lot of the infrastructure to get to parity with regular EVM. And so it's not as though the story is written and it's all done and now it's a fair fight. So, you know, as much as I am kind of touting this thesis that I think, you know, these level layer ones are superseding layer twos or whatever, it's like, we don't know until, you know, right now it's like round one of the fight. And, you know, it's an 8-rounder. So we got to give it some time before we can start calling who's actually winning.
So my frame for this whole talk, there's a few design decisions, and once we figure them out, it's all good, is not exactly it. There's design decisions. Some people got to bleed.
That's right.
Then we're going to learn.
That's right. And it's like, you know, every market in crypto, right? Like you're going to look really dumb if you call it in year one, right? So, you know, DEXs did not work for a very long time, and then suddenly they worked and they just took over the world. And I think it's quite possible that layer 2 is the same. And the race between ZK rollups and optimistic rollups is also, again, in its very infancy. We don't even have any ZK EVMs yet, but probably, you know, in a year's time, we're going to have most likely several.
Well, in a year's time, we'll have you back and we'll talk all about it.
Sounds
so
great.
Thanks to our first round of panelists here. You guys were great. I learned a lot. That was tremendous.